He told the bartender to change the channel because watching a weather report was more exciting than watching a woman drink alone, and by the time the lightning flashed on the old TV he had already bet his pride on a stranger who smiled like a secret. The bar sat 3 miles from the base and 30 years from any makeover, a square of humming neon and scuffed floorboards where the regulars knew the weight of the door and the price of regret. Friday night stacked voices on voices until they braided into a single rope that tugged at the bartender to hurry, at the jukebox to try harder, at the pool table to be merciful. She sat at the far corner with a glass of whiskey in a posture that said she had been here before, just not in this room, not with these men. The pilots arrived with the noisy gravity of young talent, shoulders squared by uniforms even when the uniforms were off, and the bar tilted around them as if drawn by the rank of aspiration. Briggs led the orbit. He was handsome in an obvious way and moved like the world was a mirror that liked him back. He elbowed Klein, who wore a grin that never quite received approval from his eyes, and nodding at the woman he said she had the look of someone waiting for her date to come back from the restroom 2 years ago. Klein asked what the over-under was on that, and Briggs said the over, always the over. Laughter drifted like foam, soft and fleeting, and the bartender polished a glass with the expression of a man who could see the weather breaking before anyone else could smell the rain. The woman ignored them with clinical precision. She rolled her glass a quarter turn, watched the amber rise and fall like a tide in a narrow bay, and took a measured sip. She wore a leather jacket whose elbows had learned a lot about leaning in boots that remembered desert dust. Her hair was pulled back without apology. If anyone had been paying attention they might have noticed the way she checked the exits without moving her head, the way she sat facing the mirror behind the bottles, accepting the small luxury of seeing a room without letting the room see her. Briggs made a show of telling the bartender to keep his friends hydrated because he was about to perform a public service. He sauntered to the empty stool near the woman and asked if she was mourning a cancelled date or a cancelled life plan, because either way he had a voucher for a better evening. She let that line end up where it belonged, which was nowhere at all. The silence that followed was not heavy, just decisive. Briggs laughed and told her not to feel intimidated by a man whose day job was pushing the sky around. She said, without looking at him, that the sky had never struck her as needing help from men like him. The table behind them loved that answer in the way a crowd loves a boxing match, cheering for contact more than character. Briggs raised his hands as if to say he could take a joke, then decided he could not, and told her he once pulled a high G turn so hard he popped a seam in his suit and passed out for a breath and woke up still on target. She said she believed the part about passing out. Laughs again. The bartender set a water next to the whiskey and told Briggs that hydration was good for humility. Briggs said he had plenty of that stored in the hangar. Klein called across the room that perhaps the lady would like to hear about the time Briggs landed in crosswinds that would make a kite lawyer up. The woman said she had seen crosswinds that would make a man confess to crimes he did not commit. Briggs leaned an elbow on the bar and said he could spot a fellow pilot by attitude, and she did not have it. She replied that he could spot many things by attitude if attitude were the only instrument he knew how to read. Her voice did not rise or harden. It arrived like a checklist and was gone like a jet that had already cleared the runway. Their friend Rowan, quiet and serious, watched the exchange with narrowing eyes. He said later that the math felt wrong, like a weight shift no one else had noticed. Right now he only asked the bartender who she was, and the bartender sighed through his nose and said that was a long story with a short ending, and nobody likes those. He tried to change the subject by turning up the jukebox until a guitar throbbed through the walls like a heartbeat that had seen combat. The storm muttered outside. Briggs, who disliked losing even a little in public, decided to reclaim the stage. He offered a bet with the oil-slick grin of a man who thought luck was a skill. He said she should name any maneuver, any simulation, any target sweep, and if she could beat his score he would buy the house around and shine her boots for a month. And if she could not, then she would admit she was just a fan of airplanes the way teenagers are fans of movie stars. She rotated the glass again, unhurried, and asked what would happen if she could beat his score using his plane. Briggs said that would be cute. She replied that puppies are cute, and then she finally looked at him. It was a look you felt more than saw, like cold air meeting bare skin. She told him he did not want to make the bet public because it would become a story he would have to live down for years. He said that sounded like a confession, and she said it sounded like mercy. The statement hung there between them as if it were considering whether to soften or sharpen, and chose the latter. Briggs laughed again, but it thinned at the edges. Klein nudged Rowan, who shook his head and muttered that some hills were not worth dying on. A wind gust shouldered the door, and the neon flickered. The bartender cleared his throat, and said maybe this was not the crowd for wagers, since the last time someone bet at this bar it ended with a wedding ring in the tip jar and a tattoo on the wrong arm. Briggs called that a cautionary tale for civilians. He turned to the woman and told her the base simulator ran all morning for pilots who needed a second date with competence. She said she had an appointment there at 0800 sharp and would save him a seat. He snorted and asked who with. She answered with a small, complicated smile that made the skin beneath his jaw tighten. Rowan saw it before the others did, the way certain words turned into coordinates. He asked if she knew Commander Hale. She said she did. Klein said everyone knew Hale. She said not like she did. It was not a boast. It was an inventory item placed on the counter. Briggs leaned closer than manners recommended and asked what exactly she did know. She told him that Hale liked his coffee black when tragedy was on the schedule and sweet when victory was near, and right now he was drinking the kind that burned. For the first time Briggs stepped back. He tried to make it seem like he was giving her room to drown in her own claims, but his eyes moved in a way that searched for exits of a different kind, the ones you take when a joke sprouts teeth. The woman reached into her jacket and set a folded piece of paper beside her glass. The bartender glanced at it and decided the weather inside had become more dangerous than the storm outside. He told the jukebox to take 5. The bar quieted as if the building had taken a breath. The morning came dressed in cold light, the kind that seemed to drain the warmth from skin and the patience from men. The base rose out of the desert like an arrangement of steel and ambition, hangars lined up in neat military posture, the control tower staring over everything with the blank expression of someone who had seen too much to be impressed anymore. Briggs, Klein, and Rowan stepped onto the tarmac with the stiff swagger of men who wanted to appear unfazed, but their eyes kept cutting toward the hangar where the rumor might be waiting for them. The storm from the night before had rinsed the air, leaving it sharp enough to feel like truth was easier to smell. Briggs carried himself like the whole thing was a joke he planned to win by laughing the loudest. Klein muttered something about how if she actually showed up, it would still be some kind of elaborate prank. Rowan stayed silent and scanned the area as if looking for signs that the day might turn into something heavier than scheduled drills. Inside the hangar, engines waited like sleeping predators, slick bodies gleaming under the white light. Ground crews moved with practiced economy, their words clipped and their gestures decisive. The 3 men joined the other pilots who had gathered near the simulation bay, an area that smelled faintly of ozone and hydraulic oil. They leaned against the railings, talking in low voices, trading speculation about who the new instructor was and why command had been so tight-lipped. Someone claimed the person was a retired test pilot brought in for a special program. Another swore it was a decorated combat ace from a NATO squadron. Briggs smirked and said maybe it was just someone who could make coffee for Commander Hale without screwing up the sugar ratio. The noise in the room dropped when the side door opened. Commander Hale stepped through first, his face as unreadable as radar static, followed by the woman from the bar. Gone was the leather jacket. Now she wore a flight suit that looked lived in, its fabric shaped to her the way only thousands of hours in the air could manage. On her chest, above the name tape, was a patch stitched in clean white thread. It read Viper. She walked with the easy balance of someone who had no doubt where her feet belong. Hale stopped in front of the assembled pilots, cleared his throat, and began speaking in the calm, measured tone of a man who knew his words would be replayed later whether he liked it or not. He told them that due to recent operational needs, the base was initiating an advanced combat simulation program designed to push their capabilities past standard doctrine. The program would be led by Lieutenant Commander Mara Keene, Callsign Viper, formerly of Strike Squadron 4 and veteran of multiple classified missions. He did not mention medals or kill counts, but his eyes swept the room in a way that implied those details were known to anyone who could read between the lines. When he finished, he stepped aside and Viper took his place, scanning the room with a look that seemed to measure the worth of each man in seconds. She opened with instructions for a mandatory simulation run starting in 15 minutes, describing the parameters in precise terms. Her voice carried an edge that was not sharp for show but sharp for efficiency, honed by years of needing to be heard over engine noise and chaos. Briggs listened with crossed arms, his mouth tilted in a smirk that was more habit than feeling. Klein stood with one foot tapping against the floor, trying not to look like he was stealing glances at her. Rowan's gaze stayed steady, his face unreadable, though he noticed how she never once consulted notes. Every detail came from memory. When the briefing ended, the pilots dispersed to their prep stations. Briggs lingered, waiting for a chance to test her patience. He told her he hoped the simulation included beginner settings for anyone who had not flown in a while. Without missing a beat, she told him that for him the simulator would remain locked on expert mode because it would be a shame to waste the good overconfidence on easy terrain. A few nearby pilots chuckled quietly. Briggs felt his pride bristle, but he forced a laugh and walked away as if unbothered. Hale caught the exchange and hid whatever thought passed through his mind. The first runs began with standard aerial maneuvers. Viper watched from the control booth, arms folded, calling out course corrections and tactical critiques over the comms. Her observations were not general or vague, they were surgical, pinpointing mistakes and timing down to fractions of a second. When Briggs took his turn, he opened with aggressive speed, pulling maneuvers designed to look impressive rather than practical. She let him finish the sequence without interruption, then told him to run it again without wasting fuel on flourishes. He argued that style mattered in combat because unpredictability could be a weapon. She replied that in his case unpredictability looked a lot like aimlessness, and weapons worked best when pointed in the right direction. The room laughed again, this time less at her wit and more at how quickly she dismantled him. By midday, the friction had shifted. The initial smirks and whispered jokes were being replaced with quiet respect. She was not just fast, she was precise in a way that made the difference between survival and loss. Even the most confident pilots began leaning forward when she spoke, hungry for the small adjustments she suggested. Briggs still tried to mask his curiosity under an air of detachment, but Rowan caught him replaying her maneuvers on the simulator's monitor when he thought no one was looking. Between sessions, word began circulating about her past. Some said she had been pulled from service after a mission went wrong in foreign airspace. Others whispered that she had gone rogue to save a civilian convoy and broken orders in the process. Rains, another instructor with a sharp jaw and a sharper temper, seemed particularly interested in feeding the more damaging rumors. He leaned against the doorway of the ready room and told a pair of younger pilots that sometimes heroics came with a body count, and sometimes that body count wore the same uniform. His voice carried just far enough for her to hear as she walked past. She did not stop, did not respond, but her eyes caught his for a fraction of a second and something unspoken passed between them, the kind of silent acknowledgement that comes only when two people share a battlefield in memory. In the afternoon, she announced a surprise scenario drill. The parameters were unconventional, multiple hostile bogies, shifting weather patterns, and a fuel shortage simulated midway through the run. The challenge was survival with the least loss of resources. Pilots rotated through in pairs, each sortie revealing who adapted under pressure and who cracked under the shifting conditions. Briggs went up with Rowan, and despite a rocky start, they finished with one of the best scores of the day. As they climbed out of the simulator, she nodded once, an understated acknowledgement that meant more than a medal in this room. By the end of the day, even the most skeptical among them understood that whatever story had brought her here was more complex than the rumors suggested. She had authority that came not from rank alone but from having lived in the narrow. The desert morning stretched wide and bright, the kind of light that seemed to bleach shadows until they became thin and nervous. The base hummed with the mechanical heartbeats of engines warming and hydraulics testing, and the air smelled faintly of jet fuel and dust. Viper stood near the edge of the runway in full gear, her visor lifted so her eyes could sweep over the pilots gathering for the day's live-fire training. The mood among them was mixed. Some wore the determined expressions of people eager to prove themselves. Others, like Briggs, had that taut look of someone walking the narrow line between defiance and curiosity. Rains stood at the back of the group, his arms folded, gaze fixed on her with the cold patience of a snake watching its prey. She began the briefing with the crisp efficiency of someone who knew there was no point wasting words when lives might depend on the minutes saved. The exercise would be straightforward in theory, difficult in execution. Multiple target drones would be launched in staggered intervals, simulating both predictable and unpredictable threats. Pilots would work in pairs, tasked with intercepting as many as possible while maintaining tight formation under fuel restrictions. The desert terrain would add crosswinds and heat shimmer to complicate targeting. The goal was not just to hit the drones, she said, but to hit them while preserving control and conserving fuel, because running out in the middle of a hostile sky was just a slower way to die. The first sorties launched under clear skies. The drones, painted in dull gray, darted like steel birds over the training range, twisting and banking to force pilots into quick decisions. From the observation deck, Viper watched each engagement, her eyes narrowing when someone drifted out of formation or burned too much fuel chasing an unnecessary shot. Her voice crackled through the comms with precise corrections and the occasional dry remark. When one pilot overshot a drone and left his wingman exposed, she told him he could always open a taxi service with those wide turns. The laughter from the others was short-lived because the next moment she was back to calling coordinates and adjusting angles with the clipped urgency of a commander who expected obedience. Briggs went up with Rowan for their run. At first, he flew aggressively, cutting across Rowan's line to take the lead. Rowan's voice over the comm was calm but edged, telling him to stay in formation or they would both pay for it. Briggs relented just enough to keep the formation tight, and when a drone banked hard toward the east, they moved as one, Rowan forcing it into Briggs's firing arc. Briggs squeezed off a burst and the drone disintegrated into fragments that spun down into the sand. Viper's voice came through immediately, acknowledging the kill but reminding Briggs that his fuel levels were dropping faster than the mission allowed. By the end of the run, they had taken out 3 drones but limped back to the runway with less than the reserve requirement. She marked it as a technical failure despite the high hit count. Briggs bit back the urge to argue. The training rolled on without incident until the 4th sortie of the day. Midway through their run, a pilot's voice broke over the comms, strained and sharp. His controls were sluggish, almost unresponsive, and altitude was bleeding faster than it should. From the deck, Viper's eyes locked onto his position. She issued instructions in rapid succession, her voice steady but urgent, guiding him through emergency stabilization. The pilot, shaking but listening, tried to follow, but the jet began to tilt into a dangerous bank. Without hesitation, Viper grabbed her helmet, ran for an idle jet, and was airborne within minutes. The radio filled with the sound of her voice giving commands while simultaneously maneuvering her own aircraft into position. She slid in beside the failing jet, so close that their wingtips looked like they could touch. With exacting control, she matched its speed and tilt, talking the pilot through a sequence that allowed her to use the turbulence from her own wing to help correct his angle. Ground control scrambled emergency cruise, but by the time the stricken jet was over the runway threshold, she had it lined up just enough for the pilot to land safely. As the wheels touched down, the comms exploded with relief. When both jets were back on the tarmac, the pilot stumbled out, pale but unhurt. Technicians swarmed the aircraft, and within minutes the cause was identified: a severed control linkage in the tail assembly, not the kind of failure that happened on its own. Viper's jaw tightened when she heard the report. She stepped aside, her voice low as she spoke to Hale, the words impossible to catch but the tone unmistakable. Within the hour, security teams were moving through the hangars, checking maintenance logs and interviewing personnel. Whispers began before the search was even finished. Some said it was sabotage. Others, more recklessly, suggested that the timing was too neat, that maybe the new instructor was stirring trouble to cement her authority. Raines's voice carried those whispers further, always with the careful tone of someone who never quite accused but never denied agreement. Briggs overheard him telling another pilot that when a person's past was as cloudy as hers, you could expect storms to follow. Rowan stepped between them, reminding Rains that she had just saved a man's life. Rains replied that sometimes saving a life was just a flashy part of a bigger game. By late afternoon, preliminary security footage surfaced. The grainy images showed a shadowed figure near the compromised jet the night before, but the quality was too poor to make out details. The timestamp was troubling. It matched the hours after the bar incident. Hale ordered tighter security around all aircraft, and restricted access to the hangars after hours. The tension in the air thickened. Even those who believed in her skill could not ignore that the evidence, however incomplete, painted a dangerous picture. Viper carried on as though the noise around her did not exist. She ran the final training rounds with the same focus as the first, her critiques sharp and her praise rare but meaningful. When the day wound down, she gathered the pilots in the briefing room and spoke plainly. She told them that the sky was a place where hesitation killed faster than bullets, that trust between wingmen was more valuable than any weapon, and that if anyone in this room thought they could fly without that trust, they would find themselves alone at the worst possible moment. Her gaze lingered on Rains just long enough to make the silence after her words stretch. After dismissal, Briggs lingered in the hangar, pretending to check his flight data while keeping her in view. She moved between technicians, asking questions that made them straighten as though they were being inspected by command itself. He realized then that she was not just running drills, she was running the room. Whatever had happened in her past, it had forged something that radiated authority without shouting for it. Rowan joined him, remarking that if the sabotage was connected to her, then someone was playing a long game, and they were all pawns until proven otherwise. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, staining the hangar in gold and shadow, she walked past Briggs on her way out. She told him without looking that the next day's drill would test reaction times. By morning the base had chosen sides like a town waking up to discover the river had changed course overnight. The mess hall felt louder than usual even when voices dropped to whispers, because everyone was talking around the same subject and pretending not to be. A tray clattered, a spoon chimed against a mug, and each small sound carried the weight of judgment. Viper walked through in her flight suit with the steady pace of someone who had decided that oxygen was for flying, not for defending herself. She picked up a coffee, black and unadorned, and took a seat where she could see the exits without hugging the wall. Conversations faltered and resumed as if choreographed. Briggs and Rowan sat across from her uninvited, which earned them a brief flicker of surprise that softened into something like acceptance. Rains stood near the doorway speaking to a cluster of younger pilots with a thoughtful frown that seemed engineered to convey concern without committing to it. The rumor machine had done its work. The footage was out there, blurry enough to suggest anything and clear enough to suggest the worst. A shadow by the jet. A timestamp that made a coincidence look like a confession. It would have been almost funny if a man had not almost died. Command scheduled a formal review of procedures that afternoon, which everyone understood was code for an informal court. Hale opened the session by stating facts and promising consequences for anyone who had tampered with base property, voice clipped and dry. Viper stood to the side with her hands behind her back and her expression as neutral as a storm front. Rains spoke first, measured and careful, insisting he respected her record but that prudence demanded every angle be examined. He never said the word guilty, only drew neat lines from the bar to the hangar to the damage, and then let those lines make their own shapes. A few heads nodded, not because the theory was convincing, but because fear loves a scaffolding to climb. Briggs surprised himself by stepping forward. He said she had saved a pilot yesterday when the discussion had been about pressure and fuel and reaction, not about cameras and shadows, and that ability counted. He did not mention the bar. He did not need to. The room already had the taste of it. Rowan added that the compromise was too crude to fit her profile. If she wanted to stage a drama for attention, she would not choose a stunt that risked a man dying on her watch. Viper cut that off with a quiet thank you, and then she asked for 15 minutes. She did not argue. She laid out a timeline the way a surgeon lays out instruments, in order, each with purpose. She referenced maintenance records and duty rosters and the narrow window between power cycles when a system would not register a diagnostic handshake. She described how a person with limited access but decent intelligence could use the 10-minute gap after the night shift to set a failure that would wake up only under stress. Not a rupture, but a stagger, a lag that would make a pilot chase control instead of command it, a push that would turn into a fall if not caught. Hale asked how she knew to look at that window. She said because she had seen it exploited before, once, and the room acquired a new stillness, the kind that happens when a story is about to become a confession or a curse. She gave them the past without decoration. Years ago, in a different theater, there had been a corridor patrol, routine in name and anything but in practice, because the maps were never as clean as the briefings. She flew lead with a wingman who had a laugh like a brass bell and a habit of humming under his breath on long flights. The mission called for a shepherd route along a convoy that intelligence insisted was safe. Halfway through, they were bounced by a pair of hostile interceptors, small and mean and hungry for a headline. She turned to engage, her wingman following, but his jet stuttered on input. It was a fractional hitch, the kind you notice only when you are already in a knife fight. He compensated, overcompensated, tried to reset, and the enemy took the gap. She burned and turned and screamed coordinates, and felt the sky shrink around them. He took a hit, not catastrophic, but enough to muddy the controls and force an ejection over unfriendly ground. They recovered him days later. He had bled out from a wound that should have been survivable if the timing had been kinder. A later investigation found a maintenance irregularity. Not a failure. A choice. Someone had taken a bribe to shave a second off a response curve in exchange for parts diverted elsewhere. She had never forgiven the neatness of the phrase irregularity for a sin that cost a life. The room listened the way people do when they have run out of jokes. Raines stared at the floor as if he could will it to open. Viper continued, explaining that the same method was visible here in miniature. Not the same hands, not the same motives maybe, but the same kind of mind. A mind that counted on noise and suspicion to do half the work. She requested access to civilian contractor logs from the last month. Hale said they were already being reviewed. She asked for the list of badges that pinged the East Hangar after hours. Hale nodded to a security officer, who handed over a folder. She flipped pages without hurry and stopped. There was a badge that had registered a near miss. A glitch that looked like a door that almost opened and then changed its mind, at 3 a.m. The badge belonged to a technician whose contract had started 3 weeks ago, a man with spotless references and a habit of leaving before his shift ended because he said the commute took him through a construction zone that his insurance did not like. Rowan leaned in to read the name and whistled softly as if the air had discovered a crack. Briggs kept his face neutral, though he felt the sudden alignment of disparate details snap together like a seat belt. Raines asked what that proved aside from the fact that contractors sometimes make mistakes. Viper said it proved a path. She asked for records of inbound deliveries the previous night. A manifest revealed a shipment of housing components for a new radar unit that no one in the room had seen installed. Hale frowned and ordered a hold on all contractor access until further notice. After the meeting broke, the base felt even more divided, but now the split ran along a new fault. The ones who had been eager to convict grew quiet, no longer sure their certainty had a safe place to stand. The ones who had remained cautious with their conclusions took small breaths they had been holding. Raines disappeared into his office and shut the door with great politeness. Briggs found himself walking beside Viper without meaning to. He told her that if the badge belonged to a stooge, the real mind would be somewhere else entirely. She said stooges are not free. Someone holds their leash, and leashes can be traced. They went to the hangar where technicians were combing through the stricken jet. She crouched by the tail assembly and asked the crew chief to walk her through the replacement schedule. He produced a tablet with logs and showed a part that had been swapped 2 days ago for a newer unit. The serial number matched a batch used by a civilian supplier with a sterling reputation. She asked if the old unit had been tagged and stored. It had. They retrieved it from a bin and cracked The day of the exercise began with a sky so clean it seemed to dare anyone to imagine trouble. The sun climbed without hurry, spilling heat across the tarmac until the air wavered above the concrete like water trying to escape. Pilots moved between briefing rooms and hangars with that particular edge in their step that came from knowing the mission on paper was only part of the mission in play. The range had been cleared, the drones prepped, the radar units calibrated. Officially, it was a multi-squadron combat readiness drill designed to test aerial coordination under shifting threat parameters. Unofficially, it was a net, and Viper was the one who had strung its lines tight. In the briefing room, her voice cut through the hum of pre-flight chatter. The objectives were laid out as if nothing unusual were at stake: intercept simulated hostile aircraft, maintain tight formations, cycle through target priorities as instructed by command. Beneath that layer were the embedded safeguards. She explained the new comm protocols as a necessary response to last month's cyber interference exercises, not as bait for an intruder. She mapped the staging zones in a way that placed certain pilots where she could watch them without appearing to watch them. The trap was woven into the routine so thoroughly that only someone looking for it would see the seams. Briggs sat with arms folded, memorizing the slight inflections in her tone, the tiny pauses where a real explanation sat hidden under the official one. Rowan tapped notes into his tablet without looking down, as if his hands had learned to listen on their own. By mid-morning, the first wave of aircraft lifted off, climbing into air so clear it made the desert below look like a map pinned under glass. Viper's squadron was third in rotation, giving her time to monitor the opening runs. From the control booth, she watched the radar display bloom with arcs and vectors, each tagged with the sharp alphanumerics of call signs. The exercise began smoothly. Pilots moved like practice pieces in a familiar game, drones broke and scattered, target locks came and went in quick succession. Then, 20 minutes in, a blip appeared on the edge of the grid. At first it registered as a sensor ghost, one of the tricks written into the day's scenarios to keep pilots guessing. But its pattern was wrong, too steady, too deliberate. It tracked just outside the boundary until the next wave launched, then began to close in. She keyed her mic, directing one of the observation drones to swing wide for a visual sweep. The feed came back grainy at first, then sharpened into the shape of something small and fast, the kind of unmanned unit favored for reconnaissance and mischief. It was not part of the exercise. Her hand tightened on the console edge. She relayed a coded instruction to shift formation in Sector 4, masking the move as a response to weather drift. On the ground, technicians began isolating frequencies, looking for the signal that controlled the intruder. Hale's voice came over the secure line, calm but carrying the weight of urgency. He asked if she wanted to abort. She said no, not yet. The net was closing, and sometimes you had to let the fish swim deeper before you pulled the line. Her wave took to the sky, the roar of engines breaking across the hangar like a physical thing. She was in the lead aircraft, with Briggs and Rowan flying as her wing pair. The climb was smooth, the calms clean, and the horizon stretched ahead in a hard blue arc. At 10,000 feet the radar lit again with the intruder, now angling toward their sector. She issued a change in vector, threading her group between two drone clusters to mask their shift in altitude. Through her visor the world was all motion and math, every angle a calculation, every second an opening or a closing door. The first rail hit came without warning. The comm net crackled and 3 channels went dead at once. Pilots reported temporary control lag, the kind that could unseat formation if not corrected instantly. Viper keyed in the fallback protocol, her voice steady even as she felt the pulse of risk spike in her blood. She told Briggs to peel high and left to force the intruder into a vertical climb while Rowan and she split low to box it from below. The maneuver was dangerous, leaving them exposed if the lag returned, but it was the only way to keep the target within reach. The intruder juked hard, cutting a path between them with unnerving precision. This was not a simple recon unit, it had evasion programming built for combat zones. Briggs came around fast, his voice tight with focus as he called its heading. Rowan slid into place, hemming it in. Viper dropped below the unit, cutting off its escape vector. She armed her training munitions, modified to disable electronics on impact, and fired. The shot was close, clipping its right stabilizer. Smoke began to trail, and it faltered, dropping altitude. She ordered Rowan to hold position while Briggs covered the rear, then dove alongside the failing unit to keep it in visual range until they crossed into the retrieval zone. On the ground, the team scrambled to intercept. The drone hit dirt 2 miles from the base perimeter, skidding into a shallow dune. Security moved in fast, crating it for transport to the hangar's secure bay. Viper landed minutes later, helmet still on as she strode to the crate. The casing bore no markings, the components inside a careful blend of civilian parts, and custom boards that made tracing origin difficult. But the control module carried a signature in its firmware, a call and response ping that matched the scanner recovered from the contractor earlier in the week. The leash had a tag, and the tag had been tugged. Before they could run a full trace, the secondary alert hit. The base's fuel distribution system flagged a pressure anomaly in one of the primary lines feeding the exercise jets. If the anomaly had gone unnoticed, it would have forced mid-air emergencies across multiple squadrons within minutes. The timing was surgical. Viper exchanged a glance with Hale, reading the unspoken conclusion: the drone was the distraction, the fuel line the strike. She ordered an immediate grounding of all non-essential aircraft, and dispatched crews to manually check every feed. The tampering was found in the secondary pump array, again with residue of the same cheap bonding agent. Someone on the inside was still moving pieces. The rest of the exercise was suspended, officially due to mechanical review. The unofficial mission shifted into overdrive. Hale authorized Viper to run a covert sweep of all contractor and off-duty personnel on base. Briggs volunteered without hesitation, as did Rowan, their rivalry with her eclipsed now by the recognition that whatever game was being played, they were all on the same team whether they liked it or not. The sweep moved in pairs, checking tool lockers, storage bays, and restricted access points. Just before dusk, Rowan's voice came over the secure channel, low and certain. He had found an unmarked crate tucked in the back of a supply shed, sealed but not logged. Inside were signal boosters tuned to the same band as the drone, and a map of the base with highlighted fuel and comm junctions. The discovery tightened the noose. The boosters were useless without a transmitter, and that meant the operator had to be close enough to maintain a link during the exercise. Security narrowed the suspect list to those with clearance and reason. Dawn rolled in thin and pale, the kind of light that made steel look honest and intentions look tired. The base gathered itself for another day, but even the coffee seemed to understand that ordinary was off the table. Viper walked the flight line with a clipboard she did not need, noting every cable and cap and seam as if attention alone could lock the world into place. Hale met her by the edge of the hangar where the desert began to yawn. He asked if she was certain she wanted to be the thing they reached for. She said certainty was a luxury and bait did not get to be sentimental. He nodded and told her the pieces were ready. The drone that was not a drone, the frequency that would hum like a promise, the open circuit in the network that would glitter like a coin at the bottom of a fountain. They set the board in motion with the calm of people who had already rehearsed their fear. The announcement went out at 8 that a controlled test of the emergency comm band would be conducted during a limited flight window, strictly internal, strictly routine. In the technical chatter that laced every base, a small signal began to pulse, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that had not decided whether to speed up. Viper took the lead position in the sole aircraft cleared for the window, a training jet fitted with a dummy core that looked valuable enough to steal and empty enough to disappoint. Briggs and Rowan were ground shadow, moving through corridors with tool bags that contained nothing as interesting as their eyes. Klein sat in the control booth with a headset and a string of diagnostic screens, his fingers ready to pretend panic while locking doors. The first nibble came sooner than anyone expected. A maintenance alert appeared for an access panel on the far side of the hangar, the kind that no one notices until it becomes a path. Security cameras caught a figure in coveralls cutting behind a stack of crates. The gait was careful and familiar. Rowan peeled off to intercept from the south side while Briggs circled from the north, speaking to each other in a language made of short words and shorter breaths. In the booth, Klein announced a phantom pressure drop in the fuel line that fed Viper's Bay. Hale ordered a hold and then rescinded it, loud enough on an open channel to sound like confusion, soft enough on the secure line to sound like theater. Viper eased the jet out onto the taxiway and waited at the hold short line, visor down, world narrowed to the rectangle of runway and the white nerve of sky beyond. Her calm was quiet on purpose. In the hush she could hear the tremor inside her breathing flatten into a straight line. She pictured nothing and everything at once, the way pilots do when there is no margin for imagination. The figure in coveralls reached the auxiliary comm junction near the hangar corner. It was a perfect spot to latch a transmitter into the artery of the base and ride the signal wherever it went. The figure knelt, hands moving with that fatal confidence of someone who believes he stands inside his own story. Rowan came up on his right, Briggs on his left, and they would have taken him there if not for the second alert that strobed across Klein's board like a slap. A second signal lit the perimeter. Not a transmitter. A vehicle. Security cams caught a truck nosing toward the emergency gate with the kind of speed that pretends to be lawful. Hale swore under his breath. 2 hands, he said, 2 hands working the same puppet. He ordered security to the gate, and told Briggs to hold off 1 count of 10. Viper listened to the lines of command twist around her like wires. She said it aloud so there would be no mistaking it. Do not pull the small fish if the big one is about to bite. The coveralls paused, head turning, some calculation unspooling behind the face the camera could not see. The hands resumed their work, faster now, too fast for someone who was merely paid. Briggs moved 1 step closer and said the name that hit the air like a dropped tool. Rains. The figure froze, then stood, turning so slowly that time pulled around the motion. The brim of the cap shadowed the eyes but not the shape of the jaw or the set of the shoulders. He told Briggs and Rowan to back off, voice steady as a metronome. He said they were ruining a chance to fix what had been broken since the day his brother fell out of the sky, and the official words wrapped it in justification. Briggs told him justification was not the same as absolution. Rains told him grief was not a synonym for treason until the people in charge forced you to choose. On the secure channel Hale said hold while security boxed the truck. Viper said negative, because the truck was smoke and Rains was fire. She asked Rains what the endgame was. He said the plan had evolved. The transmitter would spike the emergency band and when command switched to fallback the fallback would fail. The drill would fragment. No one would die, he said, because he was not a monster, but men would fall short, and some would be found wanting and careers would bend and snap where he pointed. The camera did not show the part of his face that moved when he said wanting. Viper told him to walk away before he set himself on fire and called it a lighthouse. He smiled at that, a tired small thing, and touched the junction with the tool in his hand. Klein locked the port but Rains had a key of his own. The band fluttered and caught. The air changed. Viper's comm hissed as the emergency channel bloomed into static and back, then flatlined. Across the base screens flickered, and the planned comm erupted into the edge of disorder. Rains stepped backward, as if the act had released weight, and Briggs moved forward, as if the act had poured it into his own bones. Rowan saw the hitch in Rains's hand just before it moved to his pocket, and warned him without heat. Do not. Rains froze again, and then did the other thing he had come to do. He ran. Chaos has a shape that professionals recognize. Briggs and Rowan broke in opposite arcs, trying to pin him between speed and space. Hale released perimeter units from the truck and sent them inward. Viper, who had watched this unfold without moving a muscle that did not matter, rolled onto the runway and pushed the throttle forward. The jet surged and the ground shrank, and she was airborne into a sky that sounded like relief. On climb out she saw the second part of the play blossom. A jet in a neighboring bay lit its engines without clearance. For a heartbeat she thought it was a confused pilot responding to the comm failure. Then the tail number came across her display and the line drawn between the past and present tightened until it could sing. Rains was not just running. He was taking a plane. She swung into a tight bank that pinned her to the seat and dropped onto his 6 as he lifted. The field below scattered as ground crews dove for cover. Hale's voice got into her ear through the one channel Klein had saved, thin and metallic, telling her not to fire unless fired upon, telling her this had to end without a crater. She acknowledged with a click. The sky accepted their presence like a ring that had been waiting for a fight. Rains pointed his nose toward the training range where the terrain threw up ridges like ribs. He hugged the ground to shake her, using tricks she had taught and softer versions to pilots who wanted to feel brave. She held him pinned at a distance that allowed no mistake, and imagined the brother in both of them, Lee.